A Roman slave with a broken leg discovered 2,000 years ago the secret of inner freedom. Not a philosopher who philosophized from the comfort of a library, not an aristocrat with free time to reflect on the nature of suffering from a protected position, a slave, a person who was legally the property of another human being, someone who couldn't choose where to live, how to work, who to be with, or what to do with his body. And from that position, from that condition that any reasonable person would consider the most opposite to freedom possible, Epictetus discovered something that his owners, with all their external freedom, never came to understand. That real freedom doesn't live in circumstances, it lives in judgments, and that no one, absolutely no one, can take from you the control of your own judgments if you decide to maintain it. It's not things that disturb you, it's what you think about them. That phrase, in its deceptive simplicity, contains the most transformative truth any human being has articulated about the nature of suffering and freedom. And if you receive it completely, not as abstract knowledge, but as the living understanding of something that changes how you relate to your own experience, it can free you from a significant part of the suffering you carry. Not all suffering. There are genuinely difficult things that deserve to be felt with the intensity they deserve. But a considerable part of the suffering you carry doesn't come from what happens to you, it comes from what you think about what happens to you. And that changes everything, because what happens isn't always under your control. But what you think about what happens is always, to a greater or lesser degree, available to be examined and directed. Welcome to episode 9 of Master Your Mind. This is Stoicism for Winners. The 8 previous episodes built the complete work of the first 2 blocks of this series. The first block woke you to the problem. It showed you that you react, that there are automatic patterns operating with more power than you'd recognized. And it gave you the fundamental tools, the space between stimulus and response, the work with anger, the work with fear. The second block gave you practical tools for specific situations. Anxiety and recovering the present, strategic silence, governing the mind like Marcus Aurelius, and non-reaction before provocation. Today we begin the third block, inner mastery, and we begin with the deepest and most fundamental teaching of the entire Stoic tradition, the one that's beneath everything the 8 previous episodes worked on. The root that feeds all the previous tools and that, when understood completely, multiplies their effectiveness. Judgment, not judgment in the legal sense or in the moral sense, judgment in the sense Epictetus gave it, the interpretation process your mind applies to everything it experiences, the meaning you give to events, the story you build about what happens to you, the adjective you add to reality before relating to it. That process, that automatic judgment that happens so fast it seems to be part of the event itself, is the source of most of the suffering you experience. Not the event, the judgment about the event. And that distinction, when seen clearly, opens a possibility that unexamined suffering doesn't allow you to see. The possibility of examining the judgment, of asking yourself whether it corresponds to reality or whether it's an addition the mind makes to reality, of choosing, to the extent possible, a different judgment when the automatic one doesn't serve you. That's not positive thinking. It's not denying reality. It's not convincing yourself everything is fine when it isn't. It's something more precise and more powerful. It's learning to see the difference between what happens and what you add to what happens. And from that difference, recovering a part of the power over your experience that the automatism of unexamined judgments had taken from you. There are three voices accompanying you today. Epictetus is the central voice, whose life, not just whose philosophy, is the most powerful proof that exists, that judgments are more determinate than circumstances. A man who was a slave, who suffered deliberate physical violence from his own master, who had no control over practically any circumstance of his external life, and who from that position reached a level of inner freedom that very few people in much more favorable positions have been able to match. Marcus Aurelius, who learned from Epictetus's teaching, though he lived at the antipodes of his teacher's social position, and who applied the understanding of judgment to governing the most powerful world of his era, who wrote in his meditations the phrase that perfectly summarizes what the 9th lesson of this episode will develop: remove the judgment, and you will have removed the harm. And Seneca, who observed the mechanism of judgment from the perspective of someone who lived exile, loss, and the proximity of death, and who articulated with his characteristic clarity the difference between what happens to a human being and what the human being does with what happens. All three arrived at the same fundamental understanding: unnecessary. Suffering doesn't come from circumstances. It comes from judgments about circumstances. And judgments are, to a greater degree than we normally assume, susceptible to being examined and directed. The phrase that accompanies you today is this: the fact is one. The judgment is mine to make. Let's begin. But before we begin, I want you to do something. Think about something that's disturbing you right now, not something abstract, something concrete, a situation, a person, a circumstance of your current life that produces in you a real and present discomfort. Got it? Now, ask yourself this question: what exactly happened or is happening? The pure facts, without adjectives, without the story around it. Only what any external observer could verify. And then, what is it that I add to that? The story, the interpretation, the meaning, the adjective. If you recognize there's a difference between the two things, if something in you moves when you see that difference, stop this podcast right now, go to the comments, and write this: the fact is one. The judgment is mine to make. Write it. Don't think it. Write it. Because what you write becomes a commitment that changes the relationship you have with what you wrote. The fact is one. The judgment is mine to make. Go, write it. And when you come back, we continue. First Stoic lesson. Epictetus taught the most liberating truth you'll hear in your life. It's not things that disturb you, but what you think about them. And that changes everything. To fully understand what Epictetus taught about judgment, you need to first understand who Epictetus was, not as a biographical fact, as the context that gives weight to his teaching. Picture this scene with all the concreteness you can muster. You're in Rome in the 1st century AD. You're the legal property of a man named Epictetus, secretary to Emperor Nero. You're not considered a person with rights, but an object with a function. Your body legally belongs to your master. Your movements depend on his will, your hours, your relationships, your work. Everything is determined by someone who has absolute legal power over you. And one day, Epictetus begins to twist your leg. There's no clear record of why. It may have been a demonstration of power. It may have been deliberate cruelty. It may have been a warning. The motive doesn't matter. What matters is what Epictetus said in that moment. "The leg is going to break," the master continued. The leg broke. And Epictetus spent the rest of his life lame. And what did Epictetus say when the leg broke? Only 3 words directed at his master: "I told you so." Without rage, without crying, without pleading, only the serene acknowledgement that what he'd announced had occurred. That's all. Not the rage the situation would have justified, not pain expressed as protest, not suffering added on top of the real suffering. The cold, precise observation that what he'd predicted had happened. The fact, without the judgment about the fact that would have multiplied the suffering. That ability, that separation between what happens and what's added to what happens, wasn't born in Epictetus as an accident of character or as pathological insensitivity. It was born from a philosophical understanding he'd developed through years of practice, and that was articulated in the most influential text of the entire Stoic tradition. It's not things that disturb us, but our judgments about things. To fully understand what that phrase means, you need to understand the mechanism it describes. The mechanism has 3 parts. The first is the event. The event is what happens in reality, what any external observer could verify. What would exist even if no one were there to observe it? The pure fact, without interpretation, without added meaning, without a story built around it. Your boss calls you to his office. That's an event. A colleague makes a comment about your work. That's an event. You arrive late to an important meeting. That's an event. Someone doesn't respond to your message. That's an event. The event simply exists. It has no inherent emotional quality. It's not good or bad or terrible or hopeful. It simply is. The second part is the judgment. The judgment is what your mind adds to the event, the meaning it gives it, the story it builds around it. The adjective it applies before you've had time to examine whether it corresponds to reality. Your boss calls you to his office. Judgment. He's surely going to fire me. I've done something wrong. This is going to go badly. The colleague comments on your work. Judgment. He's criticizing me because he doesn't like me. He thinks I'm incompetent. He's right. I'm a failure. You arrive late. Judgment. I ruined everything. They're going to judge me. I always do the same thing. I never learn. Someone doesn't respond. Judgment. I don't matter to them. They're deliberately ignoring me. This relationship is ending. Do you see the difference? The event is what verifiably happened. The judgment is what the mind adds. And the third part, the emotion, responds to the judgment, not to the event. If your boss calls you to his office and your judgment is that he's going to fire you, you feel fear, anxiety, desperation. If your boss calls you to his office and your judgment is that he's going to give you a new responsibility, you feel anticipation, satisfaction, pride. The event is identical. The emotion is completely different. Why? Because the judgment is different. That's what Epictetus taught. That suffering doesn't come from the event. It comes from the judgment about the event. And that the judgment, though it arrives so automatically, it seems to be part of the event itself, isn't. It's something the mind adds. And what the mind adds can, to a greater or lesser degree, be examined and directed. This is your assignment for this first lesson. Today, identify 3 moments where you can clearly separate the event from the judgment. Not the most complicated ones, the most evident. The ones that when examined reveal most clearly the difference between what happened and what you added to what happened. Write them like this. First, the event in its purest terms, without adjectives, without story. Then, the judgment, your mind applied to it. Just that. Just the separation. Because seeing that separation, even if you don't change anything immediately, is the most important first step of everything this episode proposes. Do it today. Second Stoic lesson. The same event can destroy one man and strengthen another, and the only difference between them is the judgment each one makes about what happened. If events themselves produced suffering, the same event would produce the same suffering in all people, but it doesn't. And that difference, that verifiable fact that the same event produces completely different experiences in different people, is the most powerful evidence that exists that suffering doesn't come from the event, it comes from the judgment. Think about any objectively difficult event, losing a job. There are people for whom that event produces complete paralysis. The feeling that everything is lost. The story that they're a failure, that they'll never find anything better, that everything they'd built was destroyed. The suffering that story generates is real, intense, and can last months or years beyond what the situation itself would justify. And there are people for whom the same event, the same loss of the same type of job in similar circumstances, produces something completely different. The clarity that it was time to change. The energy released by leaving a context that no longer matched who they wanted to be. The possibility that opens when a door that was locked from the inside finally opens. The event is the same. The experience is radically different. Why? Because of the judgment. Not because the people who survive the event better are stronger in some genetic or constitutional sense, but because the judgments they apply to the event produce completely different experiences. Epictetus illustrated this with examples his students could verify directly in their experience. Picture this scene at his school in Nicopolis. Two students, both have received a critique from the same teacher about the same work. The critique is identical in content and tone. The first receives it with the judgment, "This teacher hates me. He thinks I'm not cut out for this. He's right. I'm mediocre." And from that judgment, he feels shame, rage toward the teacher, resistance to study. Learning stops or becomes much harder. The second receives it with the judgment, "The teacher has identified something I can improve. This is exactly what I need to advance. I have information I didn't have before." And from that judgment, he feels curiosity, motivation, gratitude toward whoever took the time to point out what can be improved. Learning accelerates. The critique was identical. The judgment was different. The result was completely different. Marcus Aurelius documented this in his Meditations with a precision that comes from someone who observed this mechanism in himself over decades of practice. He wrote that there are people who, before the same difficult circumstances, collapse, and people who grow stronger, and that the difference isn't in the magnitude of the circumstance or in the constitution of the individual. It's in the judgment they apply. The obstacle that for one is the end is for another the material with which he builds, not because the obstacle is different, because the judgment is different. And if the judgment is different, the experience is different, the emotions are different, the actions are different, and over time, the results are completely different. That's what the second lesson offers you. Not the promise that with the right judgment everything will be easy. The understanding that the judgment you apply to what happens to you determines your experience in a much more fundamental way than you probably assumed. And that means you have more power over your experience than the automatism of unexamined judgments allowed you to see. This is your assignment. For this second lesson, think about a difficult event from your past that two different people could have experienced in completely different ways. It can be an event you yourself lived differently at different moments in your life, when you were younger versus now, in a moment of greater fragility versus a moment of greater clarity. What changed between the two experiences? Not the event, the judgment. Identify what judgment produced the more difficult experience and what judgment would produce the more manageable one. That identification, even if it doesn't change the past, gives you valuable information about the mechanism that produces your experience of future events. Do it today. There's something about the first two lessons together that makes visible the most transformative principle of this episode. Both speak of the same mechanism from two angles. The first describes it from inside. The three-part process: event, judgment, emotion, and the understanding that emotion responds to the judgment, not to the event. The second demonstrates it from outside. The same event producing radically different experiences in different people. The verifiable evidence that suffering isn't inherent to the event, but to the judgment. Together they build something neither can build alone. The embodied understanding of the mechanism, not just the theory that judgments produce suffering. The concrete evidence, verifiable in your own experience and in the experience of anyone you've observed, that the mechanism works exactly this way. And that embodied understanding, unlike abstract knowledge, has the capacity to change something real in the way you experience the events that arrive. Not immediately, not perfectly, not without the work the following lessons describe, but in a real way. Because when you see the mechanism clearly, when you understand that the suffering you feel right now isn't an inevitable response to the event, but a consequence of the judgment you applied to the event, something changes in the relationship you have with that suffering. It's no longer something that simply happens to you. It's something you're partly producing. And what you're partly producing can, in part, be modified. That opening, that possibility, the understanding of the mechanism produces, is exactly the foundation for everything the following 8 lessons are going to build. Not changing a lifetime of judgments all at once. The first step, seeing the mechanism, and then, with that seeing, beginning the work, which is exactly what this episode proposes. Starting with the tasks of the first 2 lessons, the separation of events and judgments in 3 moments of today, and the identification of how a different judgment produces a different experience of the same event. Those 2 practices together, done today with honesty, give you more information about your own judgment mechanism than any abstract reflection on the topic, because they're specific to you, to your judgments, to your events, to your particular pattern of adding suffering to reality. And that specificity, that concrete self-knowledge, is the material with which the work of the following 8 lessons becomes more effective. Do it today, with honesty, with the clarity of someone who begins to see for the first time with precision something that was always there, but that had never been fully examined. The mechanism of judgment, available to be examined, available to be modified, starting today. Before continuing with the second block, There's something about the story of Epictetus that deserves to be fully developed, because it's the context that gives credibility to everything this episode teaches. Epictetus didn't philosophize about suffering from safety. He did it from inside, suffering. And that difference, that distance between the philosopher who theorizes about adversity and the one who lives it while developing his understanding of it, is what gives his teaching a weight no academic text on Stoicism can match. Picture this moment. You're in Nicopolis, the city in northwestern Greece where Epictetus founded his school after being expelled from Rome. You're 50 or 60 years old. You're known throughout the Mediterranean world as one of the most notable philosophers of your era. Emperors and aristocrats seek your teaching. People from across the Roman Empire travel to hear you, and you walk with a limp. You've been walking with a limp for decades, since the day your master decided to demonstrate his power by breaking your leg. That limp isn't invisible. It's a permanent, physical evidence of what your life was, of the conditions from which you developed what you teach. And what you teach is that freedom doesn't depend on external circumstances, that suffering doesn't come from what happens to you, that the judgment you apply to what happens to you is more determinant than what happens to you. How does someone who was a slave teach that? Who suffered physical violence from his own master? Who spent years as the legal property of another human being, with the authority that only living it can give, not having thought about it, having lived it, and having found from inside those conditions that the understanding he taught was real, verifiable, practicable, not as a consoling theory but as the precise description of how the human mind works when examined with sufficient honesty. His students in Nicopolis frequently came from well-off families, with external freedom, with resources, with living conditions Epictetus never had. And what Epictetus taught those privileged students was what he'd learned while being another man's property. That real freedom doesn't depend on any of those external conditions, that the person most externally chained can be more internally free than the person with all the freedoms in the world, if they understand the mechanism of judgment, and if they practice directing it. That's what the first and second lessons of this episode describe, the mechanism Epictetus found from the most extreme conditions possible, and that's available to you in the conditions you have, which are considerably more favorable than his. Use it, starting today, with the two tasks, the separation of events and judgments, and the identification of how a different judgment produces a different experience. Those two practices build the foundation for all the work that produces. Do them today. There's more about the second lesson that this block needs to develop, because it connects directly with the 8 previous episodes in a way that makes visible the complete architecture of the Frong series. The second lesson says, the same event can destroy one man and strengthen another. And that truth, applied retrospectively to the 8 previous episodes, reveals something none of the 8 said directly. The anger we examined in the 3rd episode doesn't come from the event that produced it. It comes from the judgment. This is unjust. This shouldn't happen. This person had no right to do that. The fear we examined in the 4th episode doesn't come from the real risk. It comes from the judgment. This is too much for me. This is going to go badly. I can't handle this. The anxiety we examined in the 5th episode doesn't come from the uncertain future. It comes from the judgment. What might come is terrible. The future is threatening. I won't be prepared when it arrives. And the pain of provocation we examined in the 8th episode doesn't come from the insult itself. It comes from the judgment we apply to the insult, the meaning we give it, the truth we attribute to it about who we are. All the previous episodes worked on consequences. This episode works on the cause, judgment. And by working on the cause, it retroactively amplifies the effectiveness of all the tools the previous episodes built. Because now, you don't just have the space between stimulus and response, you have the understanding of what happens in that space, judgment, and you can work on it, not only in the moment of the reaction, on the judgment itself, that would produce the reaction if it weren't examined. That's what the 3rd block of this series adds to the 2 before it. Not new tools for specific situations. The understanding of the root from which all the previous tools are necessary. And with that understanding of the root, the possibility of deeper and more lasting work. Available to you in the 4 episodes of the 3rd block, starting today, with the understanding of the mechanism, with the separation of event and judgment, with the tasks of the first 2 lessons. That's enough to begin. There's something the first lesson establishes that's worth exploring in greater depth, because it touches the difference between understanding the mechanism intellectually and actually using it. Many people have heard the idea that it's not things that disturb us, but our judgments about them. They heard it on a podcast, read it in a book, saw it quoted on social media, and they nodded. Yes, it makes sense. Judgment determines experience. Got it. And the next day, when the colleague made that condescending comment in the meeting, or when the message didn't arrive on time, or when the plan fell apart without warning, the reaction was exactly the same as before having heard the idea. Why? Because there's an enormous difference between understanding a principle and having internalized it as practice. The intellectual principle lives in the part of the mind that processes concepts. It's quick to access when you're at rest, when you're reading, when you're reflecting. The internalized practice lives in the part of the mind that responds to events, the one that operates in real time, with pressure, with the emotional intensity that difficult events produce. And those 2 parts don't communicate automatically. The fact that the conceptual part understands that judgment determines experience doesn't mean the practical part applies it when the experience arrives. For it to be applied, it needs training. The same training a muscle needs to be available in the moment it's needed, not just in the theory of how the muscle works. Epictetus knew this. That's why he didn't just teach the principle. He taught the practice. At his school in Nicopolis, students didn't just hear the teachings about judgment. They applied them. They brought their real disturbances, their real conflicts, their real fears, and they examined them with the tools the teaching offered: the event, the judgment, the emotional state the judgment produces, and the search for the most useful judgment available, again and again, with different disturbances at different moments, until the process became familiar enough to be available in the moments of greatest intensity. Not perfect, not instantaneous, not without effort, but available. That's exactly the goal of the tasks at the end of each lesson. Not to add abstract reflection on an interesting principle, to begin the training that makes the principle available in practice. The tasks of the first and second lessons are deliberately simple, identifying 3 moments where the event and judgment can be clearly separated. and examining how the same event produces different experiences depending on the judgment. Those two practices, done today, tomorrow, and next week, begin to build exactly the muscle Epictetus developed in his students in Nicopolis, the muscle of separating event from judgment in real time, not just when you're reflecting calmly about the mechanism. When the disturbance arrives with all its intensity, that muscle is built through repeated practice in lower intensity situations, so it's available in the higher intensity ones. Start it today with the 3 separations of the first lesson, with the judgment examination of the second. That's the beginning of the training. Third Stoic lesson: you don't suffer because of what happens to you, you suffer because of the story you tell yourself about what happens to you, and you write that story even if you don't realize it. This lesson touches something that can be uncomfortable when said with this clarity, because it implies that to a large degree you're the author of your own suffering. Not of the difficult circumstances that happen to you, not of the events that arrive without your having chosen them, not of the real pain that genuine losses and real injustices produce, but of the story you build around those circumstances. And that story, that narrative the mind constructs around the event, is frequently heavier than the event itself. Think about this with an example you probably recognize. Someone you know sends you a message. Hours pass. The message shows read, but there's no response. The event: you haven't received a response. That's all. That's what happened. But the mind doesn't stay there. It starts building the story. I don't matter to them. They're angry with me. I did something wrong. Maybe they're ending the relationship. They don't like me as much as I thought. I'm being deliberately ignored. This situation is going to get worse. Each sentence of that story adds weight to the event, and the accumulated weight of the story can be 10 times, 100 times heavier than the original event. The original event was, you haven't received a response. The story says, your worth as a person is being questioned. Your relationship is in danger. The future you imagined with that person may not be possible. Does that story have a basis in the reality of the event? Perhaps some. There's a small possibility that some of those elements are true, but the probability is that the person is simply busy or forgot to respond, or the response isn't urgent for them even though it is for you. And meanwhile, the story the mind built produces in you exactly the anguish it would produce if all its elements were true. The suffering is real. The story that produces it may not be. Epictetus taught this with a directness that left no room for his students to evade the uncomfortable implication of this truth. He told them to examine their disturbances with honesty. What's actually happening? And what story are they building about what's happening? And that the difference between the two, between the event and the story, is exactly where unnecessary suffering lives. Not the suffering that comes from the real event, the suffering that comes from the story the mind builds around the real event, and the story is written by you, even if you're not doing it consciously. Even if the story arrives so automatically, it seems to be the event itself. Your mind is constructing it with the materials it has available, with past experiences that shape its interpretations, with fears that amplify certain possibilities and suppress others, with patterns that formed in your history and that now operate as the lens through which you see everything that happens. Those patterns, those historical programmings that produce the automatic stories, are exactly what the 8th lesson of this episode will examine in greater depth. For now, what the 3rd lesson asks is simpler: to see that there's a difference between the event and the story, and that the story, even if it arrives automatically, isn't the event. It's something your mind adds, and what's added can, in principle, be examined. This is your assignment for this 3rd lesson. Take the most present disturbance in your life right now, the one that consumes the most energy, the one that appears most frequently, and write it like this: the event, what verifiably happened or is happening, without adjectives, without story. The story, what my mind adds to the event, the interpretations, the meaning, the predictions, the judgments. And then ask yourself, how much of the weight I feel comes from the real event, and how much comes from the story I built around it? Not to eliminate the story all at once, not to deny what you feel, just to see clearly the difference, because seeing the difference is the first step toward the freedom to choose a different story. Do it today. 4th Stoic lesson. Epictetus was a slave. His own master broke his leg, and yet he reached an inner freedom his owners never knew, because he understood that no one can enslave your judgment. This is the most powerful lesson of the 10, not intellectually. At that level, all the lessons have their depth, but because of the evidence that sustains it, because Epictetus isn't describing an abstract philosophical principle that could be true if conditions were ideal. He's describing something he verified under the most extreme conditions a human being can face, in slavery. And if it works there, it works in your circumstances. Let's return to the scene of Epictetus with his master Epictetus, this time with more detail than in the 1st lesson. Epictetus has been a slave for years. He's observed the slaves around him. He's observed his masters, and he's noticed something that from outside, from a position of external freedom, would be difficult to see with the same clarity. That many of the slaves are more internally free than their masters, not in external circumstances. There the difference is absolute. The slave can choose practically nothing about what happens in the external world, but internally, in the way they interpret what happens, in the judgment they apply to the circumstances, in the story they tell themselves about their condition. Some slaves build the story of total suffering, of definitive humiliation, of the loss of everything worth having, and they live in that story with all the intensity of the suffering it produces. Others, like Epictetus, build a different story, not the denial that the condition is difficult. Epictetus never pretended slavery wasn't an injustice. It was an enormous injustice. But the understanding that there's something slavery can't touch, the faculty of judgment, the ability to decide how to interpret what happens, the space between what the master can do to the body and what the slave decides that means. That space, that territory no external power can completely colonize if the owner decides to defend it, is where Epictetus found his freedom. Not freedom of movement, not freedom of action, not freedom to choose his circumstances, freedom of judgment. And that freedom, discovered in the most adverse conditions, turned out to be more powerful than all the external freedoms his masters had, because freedom of judgment produces an experience of life that external circumstances can't completely modify. Epictetus had all the external power. He could decide about Epictetus's body, but he couldn't decide how Epictetus interpreted what he did with that body. And that limitation of external power that border where the master's authority ended and the slave's authority over himself began, is exactly where Epictetus built his freedom. The master can break the leg. He can't break the judgment about the leg. That always belongs to the slave. Marcus Aurelius understood this teaching from Epictetus with the depth that comes when someone who has all the external power in the world understands there's a territory that power can't buy. He wrote in his Meditations that the only thing completely in our power is the use of our faculty of judgment, that everything else, the body, reputation, possessions, even to a certain degree health, can be modified by circumstances. But judgment, used correctly, remains available to be directed regardless of what happens outside. What Marcus Aurelius learned from Epictetus, that understanding of the sovereignty of judgment, is what this episode proposes to you as the most fundamental work available. Not controlling external circumstances. That's beyond your complete reach. Directing the judgment about circumstances, that is, to a greater degree than you probably assumed, available to you. This is your assignment for this fourth lesson. Identify a circumstance in your current life over which you have no external control. Something that's happening or could happen and that you can't directly modify with any action of yours. And ask yourself this question: what judgment am I applying to this circumstance? Is it the only possible judgment, or are there others that would produce a different experience of the same circumstance? Not to choose the most comfortable judgment or the most optimistic one. To see that you have options in the judgment, even if you don't have them in the circumstance, and that those options, though they don't change what happens, do change how you experience it. That's Epictetus's freedom, available to you in your circumstances right now. Fifth Stoic lesson. Every time you say, "This is terrible," or "This is unjust," you're adding suffering to reality, because reality simply is, and the adjective is yours to apply. The adjective. That's the key to the fifth lesson. When something happens, the event has a reality. It has verifiable facts. It has concrete consequences. It has a real impact on the life of whoever experiences it. And then comes the adjective: terrible, unjust, catastrophic, devastating, unbearable, unforgivable, unacceptable. That adjective isn't part of the event. It's part of the judgment applied to the event. And that adjective, that qualifier, the mind, adds to reality before relating to it, amplifies suffering beyond what the event itself would justify. Think about the difference between these two ways of describing exactly the same event. First way, I lost my job. Second way, it's terrible that I lost my job. It's a catastrophe. It's unjust. It shouldn't have happened. It's unforgivable that they did this to me. The first describes a fact. The second describes a fact plus a collection of adjectives and judgments that add weight to the fact. And that added weight, though it comes from words that may seem like mere expressions of feeling, has real consequences. When you describe something as terrible, your nervous system responds to that description. It can't distinguish between the description and the reality. If something is terrible, the nervous system organizes to respond to the terrible. With the alarm intensity the terrible would justify. With the emotional state the terrible produces. With the limitations in thought and action that a state of emergency produces. And all that mobilization of the system to respond to the terrible comes from a word, not from the event. from the adjective you applied to the event. Seneca documented this in his letters to Lucilius with the honesty of someone who examined his own processing of adverse circumstances with more precision than most people allow themselves. He wrote that most of what we call terrible isn't, that we use the adjective without examining it, without asking whether it corresponds to the reality of the event or whether it's an amplification the mind produces automatically. And that when the adjective is removed, when the event is examined without the charge, the word terrible adds to it. It's frequently discovered that what remains is difficult, uncomfortable, demanding, but not terrible. Not because reality has changed, because the adjective had a weight that didn't completely correspond to reality. Epictetus taught this with a concrete practice his students applied. When something disturbing arrived, the first question was, is this really what it seems? Not to deny that it happened. To examine whether the adjective the mind automatically applied corresponded to the verifiable reality. Is this really terrible, or is it difficult, uncomfortable, demanding? The difference between difficult and terrible isn't just semantic. It's a difference in the emotional state it produces, in the resources it activates, in the possibilities of response it opens or closes. Before something difficult, the mind seeks solutions, evaluates resources, considers options. Before something terrible, the mind organizes for emergency. Options narrow, thinking becomes less flexible, action becomes harder, and frequently, what we label as terrible doesn't deserve that level of response. It's difficult, but not terrible. This is your assignment for this fifth lesson. During the next day, when something disturbs you, and you notice the mind automatically applies a loaded adjective, terrible, catastrophic, unjust, unacceptable, ask yourself this question. Is this adjective the most precise I can use to describe what really happened? Or is there a more precise, less amplified adjective that describes the reality of the event more accurately? Not to convince yourself everything is fine, to use the adjective that most precisely corresponds to reality, because precision, in the language you use to describe what happens to you, has real consequences on the experience you produce. Do it today, with the next disturbance that arrives, with the honesty of someone who examines their own adjectives. There's something lessons 3, 4, and 5 share that makes visible the work this block is building. All 3 speak of the same process from 3 different angles. The third speaks of the story. That suffering doesn't come from the event, but from the narrative you build around the event. And that narrative, though automatic, can be examined. The fourth speaks of freedom, that even in the most adverse conditions, there's a territory that remains under your control, judgment. And that territory, exercised with the discipline Epictetus demonstrated, produces a freedom external circumstances can't take away. The fifth speaks of the adjective, that the amplification words add to the event has real consequences on the experience they produce, and that using more precise adjectives reduces unnecessary suffering. Together they build the understanding that you have more agency over your experience than the automatism of unexamined judgments allowed you to see. Not total agency, not complete control over what you feel, but significant agency, a real power over the part of suffering that comes from the story you build, the judgment you apply, the adjective you use. That partial but real agency is exactly what the Stoic tradition proposes as the foundation of inner freedom, not changing circumstances, examining and directing judgments about circumstances, and that work, unlike trying to change what you can't change, is always possible, always available, regardless of circumstances. Exactly as Epictetus demonstrated, the 3 tasks of this block's 3 lessons, done with honesty, build the concrete practice of that agency, the separation between event and story, the identification of possible judgments about what you can't control, and the examination of the adjectives you use to describe what happens to you. 3 practices, 1 work. The work of examining judgment, which is the work of this episode, and of the 3 that follow in the 3rd block of this series. Do it today, with the tasks of the 3 lessons, with the honesty work requires, and with the understanding that it's exactly the kind of work Epictetus did from his condition as a slave, which makes your context considerably more favorable for the work, and means there's no excuse not to do it today. There's more about the 5th lesson that deserves development because it touches a specific use of language that has broader consequences than it might seem. Loaded adjectives don't only affect how you experience the event they describe, they also affect how you communicate that event to others. And when you share your story with amplified adjectives, you don't only produce in yourself the emotional state those adjectives generate, you produce it in whoever listens too, who then returns validation of that emotional state, which in turn reinforces the adjectives you used, which in turn reinforces the emotional state in you. A cycle of mutual amplification that makes suffering grow beyond what the original event would justify. Seneca observed this in groups of people who gathered to lament their circumstances. He wrote that those gatherings, though consoling on the surface, frequently produce exactly the opposite effect from what's sought. Instead of reducing suffering, they amplify it, because each person contributes their own loaded adjectives to the shared account, and the shared account becomes heavier with each contribution, not because circumstances have worsened, because the accumulated adjectives describe them that way. The practice of using more precise adjectives then has a double function. It reduces unnecessary suffering in your personal experience, and it produces more precise communications with others that don't perpetuate the amplification cycle. That doesn't mean avoiding sharing what's difficult with people you trust. It means sharing it with the adjectives that most precisely correspond to reality. Difficult instead of terrible, demanding instead of catastrophic, unjust instead of unforgivable. Not because you want to minimize what happens, because precision produces a more manageable experience than amplification, and a more manageable experience produces more capacity to respond effectively, which is exactly what difficult situations require. Do it today, with the next disturbance, with the most precise adjective available. Before closing the 2nd block, there's something about the 4th lesson, Epictetus's freedom, that connects with something none of the previous lessons of this episode have fully said. Freedom of judgment isn't only the freedom to suffer less, it's also the freedom to act with greater effectiveness. When judgment is amplified, when the adjective is heavier than what corresponds, when the story is darker than the event, the capacity to act is reduced, not because available options have changed, because the emotional state produced by the amplified judgment narrows the field of vision. makes it hard to see options that don't confirm the disaster narrative, consumes energy that should be available for action. When judgment is more precise, when the adjective corresponds better to reality, when the story is closer to the event than to the amplification, the capacity to act expands, not because available options have changed, but because the emotional state produced by the more precise judgment allows seeing them more clearly. Epictetus taught this with the image of the athlete. The athlete who, before competition, tells himself, "This is terrible, I'm not going to be able to, I'm going to fail," has a completely different performance from the one who tells himself, "This is demanding, I've prepared, I'm going to do the best I can." Performance doesn't depend solely on the athlete's abilities. It depends on the judgment the athlete applies to the situation. And that judgment, though it arrives automatically in many cases, can be directed with sufficient practice. Marcus Aurelius knew this from his position as ruler. Before making the most difficult decisions, he asked himself what judgment he was applying to the situation, whether that judgment was the most precise possible, whether it produced the most useful mental state for making that decision. Not the most comfortable judgment, the most useful, the one that produced the greatest capacity for effective action given what the situation required. That's the practical and completely non-abstract application of the freedom of judgment Epictetus taught. Not just suffering less, acting better, from the judgment that produces the most useful state for what the situation requires. That's the real promise of this episode, not the passive relief of suffering, the active amplification of the capacity to respond through the examination and direction of judgment available to you in the next difficult situation that requires your best response, which could arrive today, for which the work of this block's 3 lessons has better prepared you. Do it. There's something about lessons 3 and 4 together that reveals something this block hasn't fully said. The 3rd lesson says suffering comes from the story you build. The 4th says, no one can enslave your judgment. Together, they say something more powerful than either separately, that the story that produces suffering is within your power to change, not because changing deeply installed stories is simple. It isn't, but because the power to do it exists, not in an external agent, not in favorable circumstances you'd have to wait for, not in a dramatic transformation that would happen at a specific moment, in you, in the same place where the judgment lives that produces the story that produces the suffering. That changes the relationship you have with your own suffering. It doesn't eliminate it, doesn't promise freedom without work, but it shifts it from the category of inevitable to the category of modifiable. And that difference between the inevitable and the modifiable is exactly the difference between whoever lives as a victim of their circumstances and whoever lives as an agent of their own experience. Not everything can be changed. There are circumstances that are what they are, regardless of the judgments you apply. But the experience of those circumstances can be modified to a greater degree than the automatism of unexamined judgments allows you to see. Epictetus lived it, not in theory, in the most extreme practice imaginable, and what he found is exactly what the 2 lessons together describe, that the story of the miserable slave was one possibility. That many slaves lived in that story, and that story was understandable and justified. But there was another story available, the story of the man who, in the most adverse conditions, found exactly what his owners, with all their external freedom, couldn't find: inner freedom. because he chose the different judgment, not once dramatically, again and again, every day, with the constant practice of examining the judgment and choosing the one that produced the experience he wanted to have within the conditions he couldn't change, that's available to you, with the conditions you have, which are considerably more favorable, and with the same work, the honest examination of judgment, the search for the most useful story, the choice that is always yours, regardless of circumstances, always. That's what Epictetus discovered, and what this block of lessons proposes you practice, starting today, with the tasks of the 3 lessons, with the honesty the work requires, with the understanding that the power to do it is exactly where it always was, in you. There's more about the 5th lesson, the adjective, that deserves development with more concrete examples, because it's where the practice becomes most immediately applicable. The adjective terrible is perhaps the most common, but there are others that produce similar effects with the same consistency. Unjust. When something is unjust, the emotional system organizes for the reparation of injustice, which is an appropriate response when the injustice is real and when there's something that can be done to repair it. But many times the label of unjust is applied to situations that are simply difficult, or that didn't turn out as we expected, or that weren't handled with the consideration we deserved. Not necessarily unjust in a sense that justifies the total mobilization of the system for their reparation. The adjective unjust has the same amplifying effect as terrible. It produces a more intense emotional state than the situation may require. And in that intensified state, the capacity to respond effectively to what actually happened is reduced, unacceptable. This adjective is particularly interesting because it's frequently used to declare that something can't be accepted, even though it already happened and can't be unhappened. The declaration of unacceptable about something that already occurred doesn't change what occurred. It only adds the weight of resistance to reality on top of the weight of what occurred. And resistance to reality produces additional suffering without producing any change in reality, not because accepting everything is the right thing. There are things that deserve resistance, but because effective resistance, the kind that produces real changes, comes from the clarity of the state that precision of adjective produces, not from the agitation that the amplifying adjective produces. Definitive. When something is definitive, the closure of future possibilities is total. There's no going back, no possibility of change, no path from here. That adjective, applied to many situations that aren't really definitive, produces paralysis. Because before something definitive, action has no point. There's nothing to do when everything is closed, but few things are truly definitive. Most are difficult, are demanding, require adaptation and work and patience, but they're not definitive. And changing the adjective from definitive to difficult opens possibilities that the amplifying adjective closes. Seneca documented this process with precision in his letters. He wrote that his own adjectives had sometimes been the most efficient enemy of his peace, that he'd called terrible things that turned out to be difficult, unjust things that were simply inconvenient, definitive things that with the right time and effort turned out to be temporary, and that recognizing that pattern, the awareness that his adjectives were frequently heavier than what reality justified, was itself one of the most liberating works he undertook. Not the elimination of all adjectives, the search for the most precise adjective, difficult instead of terrible, unjust instead of unacceptable, temporary instead of definitive. That practice, sustained with the consistency Seneca describes in his letters, gradually produces a way of relating to events that is completely different from what the automatism of amplifying adjectives produces. Not less sensitive to what happens, more precise in the description of what happens, and that precision, as the seventh lesson describes, is what produces real calm, not indifference, precision, available to you, with the most precise adjective, in the next disturbance that arrives today. Sixth Stoic lesson. Marcus Aurelius learned from Epictetus that we can remove the judgment at any moment, and upon removing it, the harm disappears, because the harm lived only in the judgment. Marcus Aurelius never met Epictetus in person. Epictetus died in Nicopolis around the year 135 AD. Marcus Aurelius was approximately 14 years old when that happened. It's unlikely they ever met. But Marcus Aurelius read Epictetus with the intensity of someone who recognizes in another's words something that resonated deeply with his own experience. And he took a phrase from Epictetus that became one of the most direct and most powerful instructions in all his meditations. Remove the judgment, and you will have removed the harm. That phrase deserves to be examined with the attention it warrants, because it contains something that on the surface may seem too simple to be true. Does the harm disappear simply by removing the judgment? Does the loss no longer hurt if you remove the judgment that describes it as loss? Does the insult no longer produce discomfort if you remove the judgment that converts it into a wound? Not exactly. There's a distinction the phrase from Marcus Aurelius contains that can be lost if read too quickly. The harm that disappears when you remove the judgment isn't the immediate impact of the event. It's the additional suffering the judgment produces on top of that impact. The initial emotion, the nervous system signal responding to the stimulus that still arrives. It doesn't disappear through philosophical practice. It's the biological response to the event, and it has its function. But the sustained suffering, the kind that continues for hours or days after the event occurred, the kind that grows instead of diminishing over time, the kind that feeds on the story, the mind builds around the event, that does depend on the judgment, and that can be reduced when the judgment is examined. Picture this scene. Marcus Aurelius is in his meditations. He's working with a situation that disturbed him. We don't know exactly which, because the Stoics didn't document the specific events that disturbed them in great detail. But we can infer from the pattern of his writing that it involves a situation where someone treated him in a way he considered unjust. And what Marcus Aurelius does with that situation in his meditations isn't analyzing what happened or justifying his own position, or planning how to respond to whoever treated him badly. It's examining the judgment. What exactly am I calling unjust? Does that description correspond to the reality of what happened, or am I adding something that wasn't in the event? If I remove the description of unjust, what remains? What remains is the naked event, without the adjective, without the story, without the weight, the judgment added to it. And what remains, examined without the weight of the judgment, is frequently more manageable than what the judgment was producing, not because the situation has changed, because the added weight was removed. Seneca described it with an image that captures exactly this mechanism. He said it's like removing the load from a beast that's carrying too much. The beast is still there, the road is still the same, but without the load, it can move. The event is the beast. The judgment is the load. Removing the load doesn't make the beast disappear or make the road shorter, but it allows the beast to move. This is your assignment for this 6th lesson. Take something that's disturbing you and apply Marcus Aurelius's instruction directly. Remove the judgment, not permanently, not to deny what you feel, just as an exercise in seeing what remains when the judgment is temporarily removed. What is the event without the adjective you gave it? What remains when you remove terrible, unjust, catastrophic, unacceptable? Is what remains more manageable than what the judgment was producing? The honest answer, almost always, is yes. Not always completely, not without the effort being real, but more manageable. And that greater manageability, produced by removing the weight of the judgment, even temporarily, is valuable information about how much of the suffering you carry comes from the event, and how much comes from what you add to the event. Do it today. 7th Stoic lesson. The wise man sees things as they are, without adding drama or tragedy or catastrophe, and that's why he maintains calm when others collapse. This lesson speaks of calm not as the absence of emotion, but as the result of seeing with precision. There's a frequent confusion about people who maintain calm in difficult situations. The confusion says they maintain calm because they don't feel what those who collapse feel, that they're insensitive or disconnected, or that their threshold of disturbance is simply higher. The Stoic understanding says something completely different. They maintain calm because they see the situation with greater precision, not because they feel less, but because the judgments they apply to the situation produce a different emotional state from what less precise judgments would produce. Whoever sees the event without the added drama experiences the event in its real dimensions, which can be difficult, which can require effort and resources and adaptation, but which have the real dimensions of the event. Whoever sees the event with the added drama experiences the event amplified by that drama, which can have dimensions much larger than the real event, which can produce an emotional state completely disproportionate to what the real situation requires. Marcus Aurelius was known among his contemporaries for exactly this calm. Picture this scene. It's a Senate session. During one of the most tense moments of his reign, there's bad news from the borders, there are economic pressures. There are people in that room who have interests contrary to his and who are trying to use the moment of pressure to gain positions. And Marcus Aurelius is calm, not the calm of someone who doesn't understand the gravity of the situation, the calm of someone who understands it completely and therefore doesn't add unnecessary drama to a situation that already requires all available clarity. Drama, the state of amplified alarm that disproportionate judgment produces, consumes exactly the cognitive resources the difficult situation most needs: clarity, the capacity to see options, the possibility of responding effectively, and calm doesn't consume them. It frees them to be used where they matter most. That's the calm of the wise man, the 7th lesson describes. Not indifference, the precision of judgment that produces the most useful state for what the situation requires. Epictetus taught it with a directness that came from someone who practiced it under conditions where drama would have been completely understandable. He said the wise man sees things as they are, not as what he'd wish them to be, nor as what he fears they might be, as they are. That precision, that seeing without adding or removing, is what produces real calm, not the forced calm of someone who suppresses what they feel, the natural calm of someone who sees with precision and responds from that precision. This is your assignment for this 7th lesson. Identify a situation in your life where you notice others around you are responding with more drama or more alarm than the situation itself would justify, not to judge their response. To observe the mechanism. What judgments are they applying that produce that level of disturbance? What does the event look like without those judgments? What response possibilities open up when the drama is reduced? That observation, applied to others first, is frequently easier than applying it to yourself in the moment of disturbance, and the understanding it produces, the visibility of the mechanism in action, is transferable to your own experience when disturbance arrives. Do it today. 8th Stoic lesson. Your automatic judgments are old programmings you never questioned, and today is the day to start asking yourself whether what you think about things is truth or is habit. This is the most disturbing lesson of the 10, not because of its content, which is relatively clear when laid out, because of its implication, because it says that a significant part of the judgments you automatically produce about what happens to you doesn't correspond to present reality. It corresponds to previous programmings, to patterns that formed in moments of the past, with information from the past, about situations of the past, and that now apply automatically to situations of the present that may have very little in common with those. The child who learned that criticisms are attacks because his early criticisms came from people who wanted to hurt him automatically applies that pattern in the present when he receives a professional critique that has nothing attacking about it. The adult who learned that when the people he loves leave, it's a definitive loss because his early losses were that way, automatically applies that pattern when someone in his current life temporarily puts up distance. The young person who learned that failing has humiliating consequences because his early failures were that way, automatically applies that pattern when facing any possibility of not achieving what he attempts. Those patterns, those programmings, installed in moments of the past where they made more sense than in the present, run in a completely automatic way. You don't consciously choose them, they simply happen. And while they happen automatically, while they're not examined, they determine the experience of what you live with the same effectiveness as if the past programming corresponded perfectly to present reality. But it doesn't, because the present isn't the past, and present situations rarely have exactly the same characteristics as the past situations that installed the pattern. Epictetus taught that the philosopher's first work was exactly this. Not deep wisdom about the universe, the honest examination of one's own automatic judgments. Does this judgment I'm applying to this situation correspond to what's happening now? Or is it the automatic response of a programming that formed in another context? That question, asked with honesty, is one of the most destabilizing a human being can ask themselves, because it suggests that a significant part of what we take as direct perceptions of reality are actually interpretations filtered through old programmings. And that possibility, seen with honesty, opens the deepest work this episode proposes. Not just examining judgments in the moment where they produce suffering, examining the patterns that produce them, seeing where they come from, and asking whether they correspond to present reality, or whether they're the automatic response of who the person was in the past, applied to a completely different situation in the present. This is your assignment for this 8th lesson. Identify an automatic judgment you frequently produce about a certain type of situation, a pattern that appears with consistency, that you produced yesterday, and that you probably produced last year before similar situations, and ask yourself this question: where does this pattern come from? At what moment in the past did I learn to interpret this type of situation this way? You don't need to remember the exact moment. Sometimes it's impossible to identify the precise origin of a pattern, but the question itself, the recognition that the pattern has an origin that may be different from the present, is transformative, because it suggests the pattern isn't reality, it's a learned response, and what was learned can, with enough time and work, be revised, not eliminated all at once. That would be excessively optimistic. Revised, questioned, examined with the honesty of someone who no longer assumes their automatic judgments are direct perceptions of reality. Do it today. With the most evident pattern, with the honesty the work requires, with the understanding that examining the origin of an automatic judgment is exactly the kind of work Epictetus did from his most adverse conditions, and that it produces the kind of freedom he found in those conditions available to you. In the more favorable conditions you have now, there's something lessons 6, 7, and 8 together build that none of the 3 can build separately. The understanding that the work with judgment operates on 2 levels, the situational level and the structural level. The situational level is what lessons 6 and 7 describe. In a specific situation, when something disturbs you, you can remove the judgment, as Marcus Aurelius proposes, or see the thing as it really is, as the wise man of the 7th lesson proposes. This reduces suffering in that specific moment. It's situational work. Applying the understanding of judgment to a concrete disturbance in the moment it appears. The structural level is what the 8th lesson describes. The automatic patterns that produce the situational judgments again. The old programmings installed in the past that determine how present events are interpreted without there having been any conscious examination of whether those programmings correspond to current reality. Situational work reduces suffering in the moment. Structural work reduces the frequency with which that suffering appears. Both are necessary. Only situational work without structural is like putting out the fire without examining the source of the fire. It works in the moment, but the fire returns. Only structural work without situational is like examining the source of the fire without putting out the fire while you examine. The origin may be clear, but the fire keeps burning. Both together produce the complete result, the reduction of suffering in the moment through situational examination of judgment, and the reduction of the frequency with which that suffering appears through structural examination of the patterns that produce the judgments. That's the complete work the 4 episodes of the 3rd block are going to build. This episode establishes the foundation, the mechanism of judgment, the separation between event and judgment, the freedom of judgment, the adjective, the calm that precise judgment produces, and the automatic patterns that generate the judgments. The 3 following episodes will build on that foundation. How to train the mind to produce more precise judgments more consistently. How real adversity tests that. training, and what the sustained work of this series' 12 episodes produces when practiced with the consistency it requires. That's the arc that's coming, and all of it builds on what the 8 lessons you've already seen established. The mechanism, the freedom, the patterns, and the real possibility of directing them. Carry it into the next block. With the tasks of this block's 3 lessons already underway, with the understanding of the 2 levels of work, and with the clarity that the episode that follows will add exactly what's needed for this one's understanding to become real practice. Before closing the 3rd block, there's something about the 8th lesson that deserves additional development, because it touches something that practice without this development can misinterpret. Examining automatic judgments as old programmings doesn't mean all automatic judgments are incorrect. Some do correspond to present reality. The person who learned to be cautious in certain types of situations because those situations effectively produced negative consequences in the past may have automatic judgments that are perfectly valid in the present. The person who learned to trust certain risk signals because those signals were reliable in their experience may have patterns that remain useful. The goal isn't to dismantle all automatic judgments, it's to examine them, to ask them whether they still correspond to current reality, and to keep the ones that do while revising the ones that don't. Epictetus taught this with the image of the traveler who reviews his luggage before a long journey. He doesn't throw away everything he has because some of it may be obsolete. He examines what he has, keeps what serves for the journey ahead, and leaves behind what doesn't serve for that specific journey, even though it was useful on previous journeys. Judgments are the mental luggage. Some remain useful for the journey ahead, others were useful for journeys that already ended, and now only add weight without adding anything you need for the current path. Honest examination distinguishes between the two, and that examination, done with the regularity Marcus Aurelius's journal made possible, gradually produces a collection of more calibrated judgments. Not perfect, not without constant work, but more calibrated, more precise, more useful for present situations instead of being automatic responses to past situations that no longer exist in the same form. That progressive calibration is exactly what the work of the 3rd block of this series produces. Starting with this episode, starting with the tasks of this block's 3 lessons, starting today, with the honesty of someone examining their own luggage, with the intention of making the journey as light and as useful as possible. Marcus Aurelius did it every night in his meditations. Epictetus did it every day in his philosophical practice. Seneca did it in every letter to Lucilius that was also a letter to himself. All 3 examined their luggage constantly, with the honesty that examination requires. And the result of that sustained examination, documented in the texts that reached us today, is exactly what this episode proposes. Not the perfection of judgment, the habit of examining it, available to you tonight, with the journal, with the questions from this block's 3 lessons, with the honesty the work requires. Start it today. There's more this block needs to develop about the 6th lesson, removing the judgment, because there's a frequent confusion about what exactly removing the judgment means. Removing the judgment doesn't mean producing indifference toward everything. It doesn't mean the person who practices Marcus Aurelius's instruction becomes incapable of distinguishing between what matters to them and what doesn't. It means something more specific. It means temporarily suspending the automatic judgment to see more clearly what's happening. Like the photographer who removes the camera filter to see the scene without the color the filter adds. Not to eliminate the color of the scene, which is a real property of the scene, but to see the scene without the filter's addition. When we remove the judgment, we see the event without the addition of the adjective, without the story, without the amplified meaning. And what we see without that addition can be more manageable than it seemed with it. Not because we've denied the real difficulty, but because we've removed the amplification judgment was adding. Marcus Aurelius described this in his Meditations with concrete examples that make this abstraction completely tangible. He described physically beautiful things, delicious food, aged wine, luxurious clothing in their most literal and most basic terms, breaking them down into their elements, removing the adjectives that gave them the aura of desirable or enviable, not to conclude those things have no value, but to see their real value without the amplification that cultural and personal judgments added. The same applies in the opposite direction to things that produce suffering. When you remove the adjective terrible from something that happened, you don't conclude it produced no impact. You see more precisely how much real impact it had and how much was amplified by the judgment, and that precision, that seeing without the judgment's addition, is what makes it possible to respond with the right measure. Not more than the situation requires, not less, the right measure, which is exactly what real calm produces, not indifference, precision. This week, when something disturbs you, practice Marcus Aurelius's instruction. Remove the judgment temporarily, describe the event in its most literal terms, and observe what remains when the judgment is removed. That exercise, done several times with different disturbances, builds the capacity to see with more precision. That is the foundation of the calm the seventh lesson describes. Not produced by insensitivity, produced by precision, available to you this week with each disturbance. With Marcus Aurelius's instruction, remove the judgment, see what remains, and from what remains, respond. There's something about the eighth lesson, automatic judgments as old programmings, that has a very specific practical dimension that deserves development. How do you examine a programming that by definition operates below the level of consciousness? How do you identify a pattern that arrived so automatically it seemed to be part of the event itself? Epictetus taught a practice his students found uncomfortable at first and transformative over time. The practice of the origin question. When an automatic judgment produces a significant disturbance, the question isn't, what should I do with this disturbance? The question is, when did I learn to interpret this type of situation this way? There isn't always a clear answer. Sometimes patterns have multiple, diffuse origins that can't be traced to a specific moment. But the question itself, the act of asking, produces something important. It produces the awareness that the pattern has an origin, that it isn't the objective reality of the situation. It's a learned interpretation, and what was learned can, in principle, be unlearned or at least questioned. That awareness, even if it doesn't change the pattern immediately, changes the relationship with the pattern. From something that simply happens, that simply is the way things are, to something that happens because at some point in the past it was learned. And that difference between the inevitable and the learned is exactly the opening the examination of the pattern needs to begin. Marcus Aurelius practiced something functionally similar in his meditations. He didn't always identify the origin of his patterns. The meditations aren't a diary of psychological self-examination in the modern sense, but he did repeatedly ask himself whether his interpretations of events corresponded to reality or whether they were additions from his own mind. Am I seeing what's really happening, or what my mind constructs about what's happening? That question, asked honestly, is functionally equivalent to asking whether the pattern corresponds to present reality or is a past programming applied to the present. And the honesty with which it's asked determines the usefulness of what it produces. If done halfway, it produces rationalization. If done completely, it produces the visibility of the pattern. And the visibility of the pattern is the beginning of the work of modifying it. This week, when you identify an automatic judgment that produces disturbance, practice the origin question. When did I learn to see this type of situation this way? Not to produce an account of your psychological history. Just to notice the pattern has an origin that may be different from the present, and from that awareness, ask yourself the 9th lesson's question. Does this judgment serve me in the current situation? That chaining, the origin question followed by the utility question, is the most complete practice of examining judgment this episode proposes, not for all situations. For the ones that produce significant disturbances that repeat in the same form. In those, the deeper examination produces the most lasting results. Do it this week, with the most evident and most repeated pattern, with the honesty the work requires, with the understanding that examining an old programming isn't an exercise in historical analysis but in present freedom, the freedom to no longer respond to current reality with programmings that formed in another context and that may no longer correspond. That's exactly what Epictetus practiced from his condition as a slave, and what's available to you in the considerably more favorable conditions you have. Now, before closing the 3rd block, there's something that connects the 3 lessons in a way that makes visible the depth of the work this episode proposes. The 6th lesson says, remove the judgment and you'll have removed the harm. The 7th says, the wise man sees things as they are without added drama. The 8th says, your automatic judgments are old programmings. All 3 together describe the same process from 3 complementary angles. The 6th describes the effect of removing judgment. The harm is reduced. The 7th describes the result of seeing without amplified judgment, calm. And the 8th describes the source of the judgments that produce the harm and obscure the calm. Old programmings. Without the 8th, the first 2 can seem simpler than they are. If I simply remove the judgment, the harm disappears. If I simply see things as they are, I have calm. Why isn't it easier then? The 8th gives the answer. Because the judgments that produce the harm and obscure the calm aren't conscious choices you can simply stop making. They're automatic patterns with decades of history installed so deeply, they operate below the level of consciousness. And modifying them requires exactly the work the 3 lessons together describe. Removing the judgment in the moment. 6th, building the practice of seeing without. Amplification. 7th, and examining the origin of the patterns that produce the automatic judgments. 8th, all 3 together, practiced with the consistency they require, produce the gradual transformation none can produce alone. The 6th produces immediate relief in specific moments. The 7th produces the sustained calm that results from repeated practice of seeing with precision. And the eighth produces the gradual reduction in the frequency with which amplified judgments appear. Immediate relief, sustained calm, frequency reduction. Those three dimensions together are what the complete work of examining judgment produces, not in a day, not in a week. With the consistent practice the previous episodes also described as the only real path toward the changes they promise. Marcus Aurelius built it that way, Seneca too, Epictetus too. All three in completely different conditions, with the same work, the constant examination of judgment in every moment that produced it. With all the questions this episode's lessons described, that's available to you this week, with the three practices of this block's three lessons. Do them all. Each activates the other two, and together they produce what each separately cannot, the complete foundation of examining judgment, which is the work of this episode, and the beginning of the third block of this series. Start it today. Ninth Stoic lesson. Epictetus taught his students to pause before judging, to ask themselves whether the judgment serves them or harms them, and to consciously choose what to think. This lesson introduces something none of the 8 previous ones had fully said: the possibility of choosing the judgment, not just examining it, choosing it. And that possibility, which may seem too ambitious when heard for the first time, is actually the logical consequence of everything the previous lessons established. If suffering doesn't come from the event but from the judgment applied to the event, and if the judgment is something the mind produces and not a direct perception of reality, then the judgment can be modified, not instantaneously, not without practice, not perfectly from the first attempt, but it can be modified. And Epictetus taught that modification with a practice his students in Nicopolis implemented daily. The practice has 2 questions. The first: does this judgment serve me or harm me? Not whether the judgment is true or false, not whether it corresponds to reality or not. The most practical and most direct question: does this judgment help me respond well to this situation, or does it prevent me? A judgment can be partially true and completely useless at the same time. If someone criticized me and my judgment is that person hates me, and their critique defines my worth as a professional, that judgment may contain some element of truth about that person's opinion and be completely useless to me at the same time, because it produces an emotional state that prevents me from examining whether the critique has something valid I can use. The judgment that serves me is the one that allows me to respond most effectively. Is there something valid in this critique? What can I learn from it? How can I use this information? That judgment can produce a completely different result from the same event. The second question Epictetus taught is there a different judgment that would serve me better? Not the most pleasant judgment, not the one that produces the most immediate comfort, the one that produces the most useful state for what the situation requires. And that search, that exercise of finding the most useful judgment available, is exactly what the pause before judging makes possible. Picture this scene. Epictetus is at his school. A student arrives upset because he had a conflict with someone in his family circle. The student's automatic judgment is that the other person is malicious, that they did it deliberately, that the relationship is definitively damaged. Epictetus doesn't validate or refute that judgment. He asks the 2 questions. Does that judgment serve you for handling this situation? Clearly not. It produces rage and closure that prevent any possibility of resolving what happened. Is there a different judgment that would serve you better? Perhaps. What if you consider that the other person acted from their own limitation instead of from deliberate malice? If you consider that what's at stake is a difficult but manageable conversation instead of a definitive rupture? Not because those alternative judgments are necessarily truer than the automatic one, but because they produce the emotional state most useful for effectively handling the situation. Marcus Aurelius applied this practice in managing his power relationships with a consistency. His meditations document repeatedly. When someone disappointed him, the first question he asked wasn't how to respond, but what was the most precise and most useful judgment for responding in the way his position required. Not the judgment of rage, which produced the least useful state. The most precise judgment, which produced the clarity the situation needed. This is your assignment for this 9th lesson. Today, when something disturbs you, practice the 2 questions. First, does this judgment serve me or harm me? Second, is there a different judgment that would serve me better? Not to choose the most comfortable judgment, to choose the one that produces the most useful state for what the situation requires. That practice, applied with consistency, is exactly the training of judgment Epictetus taught at his school, and it's available to you today, with the next disturbance that arrives. 10th Stoic lesson. Today, you're going to practice something that can transform your life every time something disturbs you. You're going to separate the fact from your judgment about the fact, and ask yourself whether that judgment helps you or destroys you. This is the lesson that converts everything before it into practice. The 9 previous lessons built the understanding. This lesson builds the habit. The practice is simple in its formulation, though it requires real work in its implementation. Every time something disturbs you, 3 steps. 1. Separate the fact from the judgment. The fact, what verifiably happened, without adjectives, without story, without added meaning. Only what any external observer could confirm. The judgment, what your mind added, the interpretation, the adjective, the story, the meaning it gave to the fact. This separation, done with honesty, is the first and most fundamental step, because without it, the event and the judgment about the event blend together as if they were the same thing, and while they blend, the judgment operates without being examined. 2. Ask yourself whether the judgment helps you or destroys you, not whether it's true or false, not whether it corresponds to reality or not, whether it helps you or destroys you, whether it produces the emotional state most useful for what the situation requires, or whether it distances you from the capacity to respond effectively. This question has the advantage of being completely practical. It doesn't require resolving philosophical questions about the nature of reality. It only requires honesty about the effect the judgment produces on your capacity to respond. 3. Choose. If the judgment helps you, keep it. Not every automatic judgment is incorrect or useless. Some are exactly what the situation requires. If the judgment destroys you, look for a different one. Not the most pleasant, the most useful, the one that produces the state the situation requires. 3 steps. 1. Practice. Available in every moment of disturbance. Epictetus taught this practice with a regularity his students documented in the Enchiridion. Not as an occasional exercise, but as the central practice of the philosophical life. Every disturbance is an opportunity. not to suffer it, but to examine the judgment that produces it and choose one that serves better. Marcus Aurelius practiced it in his meditations every night. The nightly review we examined in the 7th episode was largely exactly this: the review of the judgments he'd applied during the day, the ones that had served, the ones that hadn't, and the decision about what judgments he wanted to apply the following day. Seneca practiced it in his writing. Every letter to Lucilius was also an examination of his own judgments, a verification of whether what he thought about what happened to him corresponded to reality, or was the amplification the mind automatically produces. All three did the same practice, and all three documented it in enough detail for you to do it too. This is your assignment for this 10th lesson. This week, with the first disturbance that arrives each day, practice the 3 steps: the fact, the judgment. Does it help you or destroy you? You don't have to do it perfectly. You don't have to change the judgment immediately and completely. You don't have to produce perfect calm every time disturbance arrives. Just the 3 steps, one disturbance at a time, with the honesty of someone who examines their own judgments with the intention of choosing better. That's the work, simple in its formulation, deep in its practice, transformative in its accumulation, exactly as Epictetus taught it, available to you. This week, with the first disturbance that arrives today, we've reached the end of episode 9 of Master Your Mind, the Judgment episode, the first of the 3rd block of this series, the one that went to the root of all the suffering the previous episodes worked on from the surface. Let's walk through today's 10 lessons. The first showed us the complete mechanism, the neutral event, the judgment the mind adds, and the emotion that responds to the judgment, not to the event. The understanding Epictetus reached as a slave, and that became the most liberating teaching of the entire Stoic tradition. The second showed us the evidence of the mechanism, that the same event destroys one man and strengthens another, that the difference isn't in the event, but in the judgment. The direct verification that suffering isn't inherent to circumstances. The third showed us the story. That sustained suffering comes from the narrative you build around the event. That narrative is a production of your mind, not an objective description of reality. And that, as a production of your mind, it can, in principle, be modified. The fourth showed us Epictetus, not as historical data, but as living evidence that freedom of judgment is real, that a slave with a broken leg found more inner freedom than his owners, with all their external freedom, and that this is possible precisely because judgment can't be enslaved by anyone else. The fifth showed us the adjective, that when you say terrible or unjust or catastrophic, you're adding suffering to reality, because reality simply is, and the adjective is yours to apply, and that the precision of the adjective has real consequences on the experience you produce. The sixth showed us Marcus Aurelius's instruction: remove the judgment, and you'll have removed the harm. Not the initial impact of the event, the sustained suffering the judgment produces on top of that impact. And that removing the judgment even temporarily reveals how much of the weight comes from the event and how much from what you add to the event. The seventh showed us the wise man's calm, that it doesn't come from feeling less but from seeing with more precision. That precise judgment produces the most useful state for what the situation requires. And that usefulness is exactly what real calm produces. The eighth showed us the patterns, that automatic judgments are old programmings you never questioned, that they operate in the present, applying responses learned in the past to situations that may be completely different, and that examining them is the deepest work this episode proposes. The ninth showed us the choice that Epictetus taught to pause before judging, to ask whether the judgment serves or harms, and to consciously choose the judgment that produces the most useful state for what the situation requires. And the 10th, which closes this episode's content, gave you the concrete practice, the 3 steps. The fact, the judgment. Does it help you or destroy you? One disturbance at a time. This week. That's what this episode leaves you. Not the perfection of judgment, the beginning of examination, the understanding that the fact is one and the judgment is yours to make, and the practice, available now, of beginning to make it more consciously. Before this episode closes, there's something I want to ask of you. This episode talked about judgments and stories and adjectives we add to reality without examining them. We all have one of those judgments we've carried for years without questioning it. One that arrived a long time ago and stayed as if it were reality itself instead of an interpretation of reality. If you identify that judgment while listening to this, if something moved when you recognized an old programming that still operates, go to the comments and write it. You don't have to give all the details, just the form it takes for you. A judgment you questioned today for the first time, a story you started to see as a story instead of as reality, an adjective you realized you were using more frequently than the situation. Justified. Write it, because there's someone else in this community who carries the same judgment, and your honesty in naming it may be exactly what they need to see theirs. In the next episode, we're going to build on what this episode established. If this episode gave you the understanding of why judgment produces suffering, the next one will give you the training to produce more precise judgments more consistently, not all at once, as a skill practiced every day, as a muscle developed with the right work, applied with the right consistency. The next episode is called The Practice, and it comes built directly on today's 10 lessons. The fact is, 1. The judgment is mine to make, and starting today, I begin to make it more consciously. This is Stoicism for winners. This is Master Your Mind. There's something about the journey of the 10 lessons that the close of this episode can't leave unsaid. The 10 lessons of this episode are, as a whole, the most complete introduction to the central teaching of Stoicism this series has produced, more complete than any previous episode because it reaches the root. The previous episodes worked on consequences of unexamined judgment. Anger is the result of the judgment. This is unjust. This person has no right. Fear is the result of the judgment. This is dangerous. I can't handle this. Anxiety is the result of the judgment. The future is threatening. I won't be prepared. Provocation hurts to the degree the judgment converts it into a wound. All those emotions, all those states the 8 previous episodes worked on, have their root in judgment. And this 9th episode reached that root. Not to say the previous episodes were wrong, they were completely right. The situational work with anger and fear and anxiety and provocation is real and necessary, but to expand that work with the understanding of the source, judgment, and, with that understanding, the work of the previous episodes deepens, because now you don't just have the space between stimulus and response from the 2nd episode. You have the understanding of what happens in that space, judgment, and you. can direct it. Not just wait in the space, hoping the reaction doesn't come. Actively examine the judgment that would produce it and choose a different one if that judgment doesn't serve. That's the step from tool to mastery. Tools give you the capacity to respond differently in specific moments. Mastery gives you the understanding of why those moments produce what they produce and how to modify the source instead of just the consequences. That's the work of the third block of this series, the work of inner mastery, and this episode established its foundation. Judgment as the source, examination of judgment as the practice, choice of judgment as the freedom. The 3 episodes that follow will build on that foundation in specific ways. The 10th episode will work on training the mind, how to make the examination of judgment a skill that improves with constant practice, how to build the muscle of mental calm the same way any other muscle is built. The 11th episode will work on the test, the real adversity that tests everything you've built, the moment where the understanding of judgment faces circumstances that push with all their force toward the automatic reaction. And the 12th episode will work on mastery, not as a final state reached definitively, but as the way of being that emerges from the sustained practice of all 12 episodes. The man who governs his mind, not in theory, but in the everyday practice of his life. That's what's coming, built directly on what this episode established and available to you. Starting with today's practice, the 3 steps of the 10th lesson, the fact, the judgment. Does it help you or destroy you? One disturbance at a time, this week. There's something more this close needs to say about the way this episode's work relates to the work you already did in the 8 previous episodes. The 2nd episode gave you the space between stimulus and response. That space is exactly where judgment lives. The space that episode taught you to create is the same space where the examination of judgment this episode proposes occurs. They're not 2 separate practices. They're 2 aspects of the same practice. Creating the space is the first step. Examining the judgment in that space is the second, and choosing a more useful judgment when the automatic one doesn't serve is the third. The 2 episodes together, the 2nd and the 9th, give the complete practice, the space where judgment can be examined, and the tool for examining it. Along with everything the 7 episodes between them built, the work with anger, which you now understand comes from the judgment that something is unjust. The work with fear, which you now understand, comes from the judgment that something is dangerous. The work with anxiety, which you now understand, comes from the judgment about the future. The work with provocation, which you now understand, hurts to the degree the judgment converts words into wounds. Marcus Aurelius's governance of the mind, which you now understand was largely exactly the constant examination of judgment, his meditations document, and strategic silence, which you now understand is possible precisely because the judgment that every provocation deserves a response can be examined and modified. All the previous episodes were building toward this one, and this one establishes the foundation on which the 3 that follow will build. 9 episodes of work already completed, a solid foundation. 3 more episodes to finish building what this series proposes. The man who governs his mind, not because circumstances are favorable, because judgment is available to be examined, always, regardless of circumstances. The fact is one. The judgment is mine to make. And starting today, I begin to make it more consciously, one examination at a time, one disturbance at a time. This week. This is Stoicism for winners. This is Master Your Mind. There's something about the 9th lesson, the pause before judging, that deserves development in this closing block, because it touches something none of the previous lessons fully said about the practice of judgment in real time. The pause isn't just a moment of waiting before responding. It's the moment where the mechanism of judgment becomes visible, when the event arrives and the reaction is ready to come out. The pause doesn't stop the reaction indefinitely. The impulse is still there. The nervous system's signal is still present. But in the pause, there's an instant where the process that normally occurs below the level of consciousness can be seen. The event. The automatic judgment the mind applied. The emotion that judgment produced. 3 stages that normally happen so fast they seem to be one. The pause separates them. And, by separating them, it makes possible something that, without the pause, wasn't possible. The question, does this judgment serve me? That question can only be asked if the judgment is visible, and the judgment is only visible if there's a pause that separates it from the event and from the emotion it produces. That's why the pause isn't an instrument of waiting. It's an instrument of visibility. The kind that makes examination possible, the kind that makes choice possible. That's what the 9th lesson, fully understood, adds to all the previous lessons. Not an additional step in the practice of judgment, the mechanism that makes all the previous steps possible. Without the pause, the event produces the automatic judgment, the judgment produces the emotion, and the emotion produces the response, all in one continuous automatic movement where no choice is possible. With the pause, the movement is briefly interrupted, and in that interruption, the judgment becomes visible. And what's visible can be examined, and what's examined can be chosen. That chain pause, visibility, examination, choice, is the heart of the practice. The 10 lessons of this episode built, not as something new appearing in the 9th lesson, as the synthesis of everything before, the mechanism that makes possible the practical use of the 9 previous understandings. And the 10th lesson, with its 3 steps, is the most concrete expression of that synthesis. The fact, the judgment. Does it help you or destroy you? Those 3 steps are the pause made into practice, the visibility of judgment made operational, the examination of judgment made every day, and the choice of judgment made real. That's what this episode leaves you. Not the theory of why judgment determines experience. The practice of examining judgment in every disturbance that arrives, with the pause that makes it visible, with the questions that make it examinable, and with the choice that makes it yours in a way automatism could never be. The fact is, 1. The judgment is mine to make, and starting today, I make it consciously, one disturbance at a time, this week, without exception. This is Stoicism for winners. This is Master Your Mind. There's something about lessons 9 and 10 together that this episode's close needs to develop with the depth it deserves. The 9th lesson speaks of the pause and the 2 questions. Does this judgment serve me? Is there a different judgment that would serve me better? The 10th speaks of the 3 steps. The fact, the judgment. Does it help you or destroy you? On the surface, they seem to be variations of the same thing, but they have an important difference. The ninth lesson proposes the questions in the time of reflection, in the moment where there's space to think with greater deliberation. The 10th proposes the 3 steps in the time of disturbance, in the real moment where something happens and where the automatic reaction is ready to come out. And that difference between deliberate reflection and practice in real time is exactly where most philosophical tools fail in their practical application. It's easy to examine judgment when you're calm, when nothing is disturbing you, when you have time and space to reflect. It's incomparably harder to do it when something has just hit you with all its intensity and the reaction is ready to come out before you've had time to think. And yet, it's exactly in that second moment, in the time of disturbance, where the work matters most, because in the time of reflection, the disturbance has already passed. The moment where examining the judgment could have produced a different response is no longer available. For the examination of judgment to work when it matters most, it needs to have been practiced sufficiently in lower intensity moments. That's exactly what the 10th lesson proposes. Not practicing only when there's time and space, practicing with every disturbance that arrives, large or small, intense or moderate. Today's small disturbance is the training for tomorrow's big disturbance. Examining judgment in today's mildly irritating comment builds the capacity to examine judgment in the devastating loss that arrives later. Exactly like the athlete who doesn't train only when the match is important, who trains every day so that when the match arrives, the capacity is available. Marcus Aurelius understood it this way. His meditations document the examination of small and large disturbances with the same attention. He didn't reserve the work for crises. He applied it to everyday irritations too, because everyday irritations are exactly the training for crises, and crises are exactly the moment where the training from everyday irritations manifests. That's what the 10th lesson proposes. Not the occasional practice of examining judgment when something important happens, the constant practice with every disturbance that arrives, this week, the next, and the one after, until the process becomes familiar enough to be available in the moments of greatest intensity, not perfect, not instantaneous, but available. That's the goal, and it's within reach of anyone who practices with the consistency it requires. The fact is, 1, the judgment is mine to make, and with practice, I make it with increasing consciousness, one disturbance at a time, starting today. This is Stoicism for winners. This is Master Your Mind. Now comes the part that separates those who listen from those who truly change. This community exists because you decide it exists, not with words, with actions. If something you heard today moved you inside, leave your reflection here. The one that gets the most support becomes the banner of this community, the collective voice of everyone who chose not to give up. A community that doesn't run from pain, that walks through it, with courage, with judgment, with honor. But listening isn't enough. You know it. You feel it. There's a difference between the one who consumes wisdom and the one who turns it into armor. That's why we created the Stoic Code. 2 principles forged over millennia by the most powerful minds in history. It's not just another book. It's a manual of psychological warfare against your own weaknesses. Each principle includes the deep teaching, its modern application, and an exercise you can implement today, not tomorrow, today. If you decide to get it, you're not just taking something for your growth. You become part of this mission. You help us bring Stoicism to thousands of people who are right now where you once were, who struggle, who fall, who need a word to remind them who they are. Your support keeps this podcast alive. It drives it, it expands it. Thanks to you, this doesn't stop. The link is in the description of this episode. Everything you need is right there. We'll see you in the next episode of Stoicism for Winners. Every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, without fail. Stoic sessions designed to be with you when life gets heavy, when staying calm is hard, when you need someone to remind you who you are before you forget it yourself. Follow us. The Stoic who doesn't train in calm won't find calm when the storm arrives. Until the next episode, we walk this path together, and every day there are more of us who choose not to give up. Remember this: you are the sole owner of your perception, the architect of your peace, the only one responsible for the war you choose to fight or the one you choose to end. That is Stoicism, not a philosophy, a way of being unbreakable. This is Stoicism for Winners.